So you're all set and ready to build, but as soon as you get to your creative world, you realize you're a big dummy with no ideas. Don't worry, I can relate. You could of course always wait until you get a good idea, but we all know that only happens as often as I get the recommended amount of sleep. So we're gonna have to find a better way to get ideas into that dumb brain. The best thing you can do to get ideas is to use a reference. I like to use a lot of concept art for references because there's a lot of really cool fantasy houses out there, and it works really well with my style. I've been getting most of my references for my build from Pinterest. I find that the recommendations on there are a lot more useful than the other sites I've used. I do know some other people that just use Google Images or use other sites like ArtStation. Alright, but how do you actually pick a reference though? Today we're going to be using this one. Whenever I'm looking for a reference, I mainly look for good, interesting shapes. On this one I really like the slanted shape of the roofs, and it also has a lot of good depth with the different sections of the building. Over time you'll figure out what shapes are the most interesting to you. When I actually start building, I like to go in first with a wireframe just to get the overall shape in. Just make an outline for each segment of the roof and each body section of the building. Try and separate each part of the building into as simple a shape as you can. Most buildings can be easily simplified down into different segments of cylinders, rectangles, and triangles. During this phase, it's usually good to keep in mind how big you like to build. A lot of people find it more comfortable to build in bigger or smaller styles. Just keep in mind that on smaller builds, you will have to simplify all the details a bit more, and on the larger build, you'll have a lot more to fill out. Also make sure that when you're changing the sizes, everything stays in good proportion to each other. I like to measure everything from the size of the door, since the door tends to be around the size of a person. For example, if you're trying to build a 2-story house, you don't want the door to take up both stories. You need to make sure that everything's in good proportion to each other to make sure that the size is convincing. Now is also a good time to take a step back and look at the overall shape of the building. Something to keep in mind is that drawings and photographs have a lot more ways to detail flat surfaces than we can in Minecraft. So you may decide that in order to add a bit more detail to certain areas, you might have to change the shape around a bit. On this build, I decided to add a few dormer segments to the roof, just because I thought it seemed a bit flat. I also like doing things like exaggerating the curve of roofs, or making some of the overhangs a bit more prominent. Just try and change a few little things to give the build your own touch. Once you've got the shape looking good, you can start to worry about the coloring. Coloring is the phase where you can really make or break a build, and it's the portion where I always struggle. Since we are working from a reference, if you didn't already know what colors you were going to use, you can always try and copy the colors from the image. Trust me though, this is a lot more difficult than it sounds. There isn't always one block that you can use for each color that you'll find, so you might have to blend together multiple blocks in order to get the color just right. But for this build, I used this color palette. I tend to lean toward using a bit more colorful and saturated color palettes, just because I think they look nice. I suggest messing with the colors in different ways just to see what you like. If you want to try something a bit different, I've been seeing these pre-made block palettes on Instagram. A lot of them have pretty good color combinations, so if you need ideas, browsing through them might not be such a bad idea. Building from references is also how you learn and develop your style. Over time, you'll slowly accumulate different detailing tricks to make all of your builds better. So references are all fine and good, but maybe you don't want to use one, or let's just say hypothetically, you're too lazy to go out and actually find a reference. Don't worry, there are still some things you can do. So we're gonna start a new build for this one. When I started this one, my brain was completely mush. I probably should have gone to bed because it was pretty late, but no, I wanted to build. All you need to do for this is just start throwing random squares at the ground. What's amazing about building like this is the less you have in your mind when you're starting, the better it tends to look. Just put down random squares in places that you think looks nice. You can also start adding roofs and stuff like that too. Just place blocks and see what comes out. Every few minutes I'll take a step back just to see what I have. I'll see what looks nice and see what needs to be moved around. After you have a few blocks on the ground, you might start to get a bit of an idea of what you want to build. You can also spend some time squishing things around and moving pieces around until it looks right. For this build, I eventually got these 3 segments, which seemed like an interesting shape to me. I eventually came back around and squished them in a bit more, which for some reason made it look a bit like an evil mansion to me. By the way, at this point I had gone to bed and then later came back to figure out what I'm actually doing with this. I decided to put some trees around different points in the roof just to make it look a bit more overgrown. At some point I decided this was going to be in a swamp, so I decided to add a bit of terrain around the bottom of the building. On a lot of my swampy builds, I like to give the base of the building a bit of an organic or flowy feel, and I do this just by making it connect up to the terrain a bit more. So I blended everything on the lower sections and just made everything a bit more curved. Figuring out what blocks to use for these builds is going to be a lot more difficult because we don't have any actual references to go with this time. Over time, you'll get better at figuring out what colors go with what environment, but there is also nothing stopping you from going out and finding a reference now just to take the colors. I suggest trying to practice with both of these strategies for starting builds. What I end up doing a lot of the time is using some odd mixture of these. I'll start a project trying to just use the random blocks, but then I'll either get confused or it'll remind me of something I've seen before, and then I'll have to go and find a reference to finish off the build. Just try out different things and see what works for you. The main goal with these is just to help you get the initial something on the ground when you're getting started. Good ideas don't come when you're just waiting around for them. Ideas tend to come up during the process. So if you're just sitting around waiting for a good idea to show up, it's never gonna come. It's only after you get started, once you really know what you're trying to do. Also, for all of y'all lazy people like me, I'll have my Pinterest board linked in the description, just in case y'all are in need of some reference.